The Buford family appears in the 1850 census of Taney County, Missouri, listed as free white persons, farming a narrow strip of bottomland along a creek that still does not appear on most road maps. 6 children, a log house, a small stand of corn on ground that had been cleared by hand from oak and hickory forest less than a decade before. The census taker wrote them down the way he wrote down every other family on that page, and nothing about the entry marks it as unusual. That is the entire point. For 170 years, that census page was the whole story. Then, in the space of about 10 years, a wave of consumer DNA testing reached deep into the hollows and ridgelines of the Ozark Plateau, and thousands of families who had always understood themselves as English, Scots-Irish, or German began receiving results that did not match anything written down. Small, consistent, unmistakable segments of Native American and West African ancestry appearing again and again in families who had never once heard those words spoken aloud at a supper table. What the DNA shows and what the family record contains are not the same document, and the gap between them is where this story actually lives. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Ozark Plateau sits across the southern half of Missouri and the northern half of Arkansas, a raised, folded stretch of limestone and dolomite carved by rivers into ridges and hollows that made travel genuinely difficult until well into the 20th century. Before any of the families on that 1850 census page arrived, the region belonged to the Osage Nation, whose hunting grounds extended across much of what is now the Ozark Highlands. The Osage signed away most of that territory in a series of treaties beginning in 1808 and continuing through 1825, ceding land under pressure that left them with a fraction of what they had held a generation earlier. Cherokee families moved through and briefly settled parts of northern Arkansas in the years before the forced removal of 1838, some staying long enough to intermarry with the earliest white settlers pushing into the hill country, others continuing on toward Indian territory under military escort. The land the Buford family and thousands like them cleared in the 1840s and 1850s was, within living memory of the people doing the clearing, still Osage and Cherokee country. The Osage cessions came in stages, and the dates matter for anyone tracing a specific family into this ground. The Treaty of Fort Clark in 1808 took the first large bite out of Osage territory across what is now northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. A second round of treaties through the 1820s pushed the boundary further west, and by 1825 the Osage had ceded the bulk of the Ozark Plateau to the United States government, retaining only a reservation far to the west in what is now Kansas. Cherokee families entered the same ground from a different direction and for different reasons. A group later remembered as the Old Settlers, or the Western Cherokee, began migrating voluntarily into Arkansas territory as early as 1810, more than 2 decades before the forced removal most people associate with the Cherokee name. A tract in northwest Arkansas known at the time as Lovely's Purchase, negotiated in 1816, was set aside specifically for these early Cherokee arrivals before shifting federal policy pushed even that population further west into Indian territory through the 1820s and 30s. For a full generation, Osage and Cherokee families lived on, moved through, and in some documented cases intermarried into the same hollows and river valleys that white settlers were simultaneously beginning to clear. The settlers who replaced them came in a specific and traceable pattern. Scots-Irish families moved down out of the Appalachian valleys through Tennessee and Kentucky, following the same general migration corridor that had carried their grandparents across the Atlantic and down the Great Wagon Road a century earlier. English families arrived more directly, often from Virginia and the Carolinas. German immigrants settled heavily along the Missouri River corridor to the north and filtered south into the eastern Ozark counties in smaller numbers, drawn by cheap land and the promise of timber and mineral rights. What all 3 groups found once they arrived was terrain that actively discouraged movement. Roads worth the name did not reach much of the interior Ozarks until the 1920s and 30s. A family settling a hollow in Taney County or Stone County or Boone County, Arkansas, in 1850 might live within walking distance of perhaps a dozen other families for the next 3 generations, and marry almost exclusively within that same small pool of neighbors. Genealogists working these counties run into a second, more mundane obstacle almost immediately, one that compounds the isolation rather than explaining it away. A number of Ozark County courthouses burned during the 19th and early 20th centuries, taking decades of deed books, marriage licenses, and probate files with them. Taney County's courthouse burned in 1885. Christian County lost records to fire as well, decades apart, in separate incidents. Where a courthouse fire falls in the middle of the exact years when a mixed ancestry union would most likely have been recorded, or deliberately left unrecorded, the fire does something close to what the family's own silence did on its own. It removes the paper trail that might have settled the question either way, leaving the DNA as the only surviving witness to a decision the county clerk's office can no longer confirm or deny. That isolation is not incidental to the genetic story, it is the genetic story. A population that intermarries within a narrow circle for several generations produces exactly the kind of DNA signature that shows up in Ozark test results today, a signature geneticists call a founder effect, in which specific genetic markers, present in only a handful of the original settlers, appear at far higher frequency in their descendants than in the broader population they came from. Medical researchers studying isolated Ozark communities through the middle of the 20th century documented elevated rates of certain recessive genetic conditions in specific hollows and counties, conditions traceable to a small number of shared ancestors 2 or 3 generations back. The same mechanism that concentrated those recessive conditions also concentrated something else, smaller and far less visible on a hospital intake form, the Native American and African ancestry that entered a handful of founding families in the earliest years of settlement, and then simply stayed in the gene pool, diluted but never fully erased, passed down through a population too isolated to marry it back out. What the autosomal DNA results show, family after family, is a specific and repeating pattern. A person whose entire paper trail runs English and Scots-Irish back to the 1840s receives a result showing 1 to 4% Native American ancestry, sometimes paired with a smaller, similarly persistent segment of West or Central African ancestry, usually in the range of 0.5% to 2%. Genetic genealogists working with descendant populations across the upland South, including Ozark, Appalachian, and Melungeon-adjacent communities, have documented this same combination often enough that it has become a recognizable signature rather than an anomaly. The Melungeon DNA Project, which spent years collecting samples from families of the Cumberland Gap and East Tennessee Highlands who carry an almost identical oral tradition of unexplained dark features and unnamed ancestry, found the same recurring combination of small Native American and small Sub-Saharan African segments sitting inside populations whose paper genealogy read as purely English and Scots-Irish. The Ozark pattern is not identical to the Melungeon pattern, and the two communities descend from different founding populations separated by hundreds of miles. But the underlying mechanism, an early admixture event absorbed into an isolated white-presenting population and then concentrated rather than diluted by generations of endogamous marriage, is the same mechanism in both places, and it produces the same shape of result on a modern ethnicity estimate. The amount is too small to represent a single event in living memory, and too consistent across unrelated family lines in the same counties to represent isolated coincidence. What it represents, according to the pattern the DNA itself lays out, is an admixture event that happened early, likely within the first 1 or 2 generations of settlement, when the boundary between the incoming white settlers and the Osage, Cherokee, and free and enslaved black populations already present in the region was still thin enough to cross. A segment inherited from a single ancestor 5 or 6 generations back would ordinarily be diluted to almost nothing by now, halved with each generation the way any inherited segment is halved. That it still shows up clearly and repeatedly in so many Ozark test results is itself evidence of the isolation. In a population marrying outward, the segment would have vanished below detection 2 or 3 generations ago. In a population marrying almost exclusively within the same handful of interrelated hollow families, the same ancestral segment gets reintroduced from multiple directions at once, cousin marrying cousin without either party necessarily knowing it, and the concentration holds far longer than genetic dilution alone would predict. The historical record for exactly how that crossing happened is fragmentary by design and by circumstance both. Frontier marriage in the early 19th century Ozarks was not always performed by a licensed minister or recorded by a county clerk, particularly in the years before a county even had a functioning courthouse. A Cherokee or Osage woman marrying into a white settler household, or a free black woman doing the same in the years before Missouri's increasingly restrictive antebellum racial statutes made such unions legally fraught, might leave no documentary trace beyond her children's names on a later census, if that. An itinerant preacher passing through a hollow once or twice a year could perform a marriage that no clerk ever recorded, and in the earliest years of settlement, before a county even had a functioning courthouse to record it in, a couple might simply be considered married by the community's own recognition, a standard that satisfied the neighbors completely and left the state's paperwork with nothing at all. What the record does contain, scattered across county histories, church minute books, and probate files, are the edges of these unions. a will that names a wife by first name only, with no maiden name recorded, a guardianship filing for children whose mother is never identified by surname, family Bible in which one branch simply stops being written down after a certain generation. Where a document should exist and does not, the absence itself becomes part of what the DNA is now filling in. The mechanism by which that early ancestry disappeared from the family record has a name, and it is not a subtle one. Missouri's antebellum legal code, like that of most slaveholding states, classified a person's race according to a fraction of ascertainable black ancestry, a standard that grew stricter rather than looser as the 19th century went on. A family with a documented or strongly suspected black or native ancestor had a direct legal and social incentive to obscure that ancestor from the written record, particularly once Missouri entered the Union as a slave state in 1821 and Arkansas followed a generation later. The safest path for a family with mixed ancestry that could plausibly present as white was to do exactly that, and to make sure the next generation's official paperwork reflected it. Census enumerators, who typically visited a household once a decade and recorded race based on visual judgment rather than any documentary proof, cooperated with this erasure whether they intended to or not. A family recorded as mulatto in one census and white in the next is not a rare anomaly in Ozark County records. It is a pattern researchers have documented repeatedly, county after county, decade after decade, as families crossed the color line the moment local circumstances allowed it. Where the family record itself would not hold the truth, oral tradition often did, in a coded and deliberately deniable form. Across the upland South, and the Ozarks in particular, families with unexplained dark hair, dark eyes, or high cheekbones frequently attributed the trait to Black Dutch ancestry, a phrase that appears constantly in Ozark family lore and almost nowhere in any actual immigration record from the Netherlands. Genealogists and folklorists who have studied the phrase at length have concluded, based on where and when it appears, that it functioned as a euphemism, a way for a family to acknowledge visibly non-English ancestry without naming it as Native American or Black, either of which carried real legal and social consequences under Jim Crow-era racial classification long after slavery itself ended. The folklorist Vance Randolph, who spent decades in the early 20th century collecting Ozark oral tradition, dialect, and superstition directly from hill families, documented the phrase and its variants repeatedly in his fieldwork, noting how consistently families used it to explain a grandmother's or great-grandmother's appearance without ever specifying what it was actually standing in for. Black Dutch, in the way it was used across Ozark Hollows for a century and more, was never really about the Netherlands. It was a container built to hold something a family needed to acknowledge and could not afford to name. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The legal machinery behind that erasure was specific, and it tightened over time rather than loosening. Missouri's antebellum statutes defined a mulatto as any person with a documented degree of African ancestry down to 1/8, later interpreted in practice at even narrower fractions in some counties, meaning a single great-great-grandparent could theoretically place a person on the wrong side of the color line if a neighbor, a rival, or an aggrieved relative chose to raise the question in court. Arkansas's statutes followed a similar trajectory. Neither state's law made any comparable provision for Native American ancestry specifically, which left families with an Osage or Cherokee great-grandmother in a strange legal gray zone, one that in practice usually resolved in the family's favor precisely because the law had not bothered to define it. A family with an unrecorded Osage ancestor could often continue to be recorded as white without technically violating anything on the books, so long as no one asked too many questions and the physical appearance of the children did not draw obvious comment from a census enumerator moving quickly through a rural township. A family with any documented black ancestry, however distant, had no such gray zone available to it, which is very likely why the Black Dutch euphemism absorbed both kinds of ancestry indiscriminately. The phrase did not need to specify which kind of unrecorded ancestor it was protecting. It only needed to close the question before anyone official asked it directly. A second family thread, unrelated to the Bufords by blood, but strikingly similar in shape, comes out of Newton County, Arkansas, deep in the Boston Mountains section of the plateau. The Whitledge family settled a hollow there in the 1850s, arriving from Tennessee by way of the same Scots-Irish migration corridor that carried thousands of families into the region in that decade. County records show the family consistently as white across every surviving census from 1860 forward, farming the same narrow valley for 4 generations without interruption. What those records do not show, And what a family history compiled by a descendant in the 1970s and later donated to a regional genealogical library does show is a specific piece of testimony credited to a woman remembered only as Aunt Cindy, a Whitledge daughter born around 1855, who reportedly told her grandchildren late in her life that her own mother had come from over the state line, from Indian Territory, and that the family had agreed among themselves decades earlier never to put that fact on paper because of what it might cost the children's standing in the community. No maiden name survives for Aunt Cindy's mother. No document in Newton County confirms or contradicts the story. What a DNA test taken by one of Aunt Cindy's great-great-grandsons in the past several years did confirm, independently and with no knowledge of the family history document at the time the test was ordered, was a small but clearly present Native American segment, consistent in size with an ancestor roughly 4 to 5 generations back, exactly where the family's own half-remembered oral tradition placed her. The confession, where it survives at all, tends to arrive the same way it arrives in so many Ozark families, late, in a low voice, and from the oldest woman in the house. According to family accounts collected by regional genealogical societies across Missouri and Arkansas, a pattern recurs often enough to be recognizable on its own. A grandmother, near the end of her life, tells a grandchild something the official family history does not contain. Sometimes it is phrased directly, an acknowledgement of Cherokee or Osage blood, a generation or two back. More often it arrives sideways, in the language the family always used. She was Black Dutch, the grandmother says, or her people came from over toward the nation, using the old regional shorthand for what had once been Indian Territory just across the Arkansas border, or she just never would talk about her own mother, and we all knew better than to ask. These accounts, where they have been preserved at all, tend to survive in exactly the informal places you would expect. A note tucked into a family Bible, a story recorded decades later by a grandchild for a local historical society newsletter, a line in a self-published family history that the author clearly did not know what to do with and included anyway. What makes these confessions genealogically significant rather than simply sentimental is how consistently they now line up with what the DNA independently shows. A family with an oral tradition of a Cherokee or Osage great-great-grandmother, and no documentary trace of her at all, frequently returns a DNA result with exactly the small, isolated Native American segment the founder effect model predicts. A family with a whispered story about a great-grandmother who was, in the language one Stone County descendant used in a testimony preserved by a county historical society in the 1980s, not quite what the neighbors thought she was, returns a result with the paired Native and African segments that the historical record suggests entered the Ozark gene pool in its earliest, least documented years. The oral tradition and the genetic result were generated independently of each other, decades and sometimes generations apart, by people with no access to each other's information. When they converge this precisely and this often, across unrelated families in different counties, the convergence itself becomes a form of evidence, corroborating what neither the census nor the courthouse was ever willing to write down. These testimonies survive today in a scattering of places that have almost nothing in common except that none of them were ever intended to end up as genealogical evidence. A county historical society newsletter, typed on a mimeograph machine in the 1960s and reprinted from a longer oral history interview nobody thought to preserve in full. A cassette tape recorded by a granddaughter sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table sometime in the 1980s, transcribed decades later once a family member finally learned how to digitize it. A handwritten note tucked inside the cover of a family Bible, unsigned, undated, identifying a woman only by a first name and the phrase, "her people were different." None of these documents were built to survive scrutiny. They were built, if they were built with any intention at all, simply to make sure that one specific fact did not disappear entirely from a family's memory, even if it could never appear on anything the county would keep on file. That so many of them turn out, decades later, to align with an independent genetic result is not something any of the people who recorded them could have anticipated or engineered. It is simply what happens when a family tells the truth in the only form it was safe to tell it in, and waits 100 years for the rest of the world to catch up. The Buford family's own later history illustrates the pattern without needing embellishment. Descendants who remained in Taney County through the early 20th century continued to marry within the same small circle of hollow families that had sustained the community since the 1850s. The same isolation that concentrated recessive genetic conditions in the region, also concentrating whatever ancestry had entered the line in its founding generation. A family account passed down through one branch and later shared with a regional genealogical group describes a great-grandmother, born sometime around 1860, who was remembered as having very dark hair and a complexion the family always described, without further explanation, as different. No maiden name for her survives in any document the family has located. The census lists her only by first name and her husband's surname, a pattern repeated across dozens of similar entries throughout the Ozark counties in that period, where a woman's origin simply was not considered information worth recording once she had married into a white household. What survives of that missing origin now lives almost entirely in the genome of her descendants, 4 and 5 generations removed, most of whom never heard her name spoken until a DNA test sent them looking for an explanation their family paperwork could not provide. This is, in a specific and traceable sense, what genetic genealogists mean when they describe DNA as a record that cannot be edited after the fact the way a census entry or a family Bible can. A county clerk could reclassify a family's race between one census and the next. A family could stop mentioning a great-grandmother's origin, could let Black Dutch absorb whatever the truth actually was, could raise the next generation with no knowledge that there was anything to ask about at all. None of that touched the actual genetic material passed down through every one of those generations, sitting inert and undiscussed in cell after cell, waiting for a test that would not exist for another century and a half. The scale of what this means across the region is not a matter of one family's story. Genetic genealogists working with descendant populations across the Ozark Plateau and researchers studying the closely related Melungeon communities of the upland South more broadly have identified this same small, persistent combination of Native American and African ancestry in family after family whose paper trail shows nothing but English, Scots-Irish, and German names going back to first settlement. The pattern is consistent enough, and geographically clustered enough, that it points to a shared set of founding circumstances rather than isolated individual exceptions. Somewhere in the first 2 or 3 generations after the Osage and Cherokee were pushed out of the Ozark Highlands, a number of the white families replacing them formed unions, recorded and unrecorded, with Native and Black individuals who were still present in the region during those transitional decades. Those unions produced children who were absorbed into white household after white household as the legal and social cost of any other classification rose. Their descendants intermarried within an isolated hill population for 6 or 7 generations, concentrating that early ancestry rather than diluting it out, and carried it forward, unnamed and largely unknown, until a saliva sample and a mail-in kit finally gave it a number. Free Black communities in Missouri and Arkansas before and immediately after the Civil War add another layer the DNA evidence has to account for, one that county records treat almost as inconsistently as they treat Osage and Cherokee intermarriage. Small numbers of free Black families are documented in Ozark border counties in the decades before the war, some of them landowners in their own right, their presence recorded in scattered deed books and tax rolls even where their later descendants are not. After emancipation, formerly enslaved families across the same counties faced their own version of the choice that had already shaped earlier generations, whether to remain visibly and legally Black under Missouri's and Arkansas's post-war racial codes, with everything that classification restricted, or to relocate, change how a name was recorded, and let a lighter-skinned branch of the family quietly cross into the white community over the following 1 or 2 generations. Historians who have traced individual Ozark families through exactly this transition describe a recognizable set of markers: a family surname that appears in a Freedmen's Bureau record or an early post-war tax roll classified as colored, then reappears a decade or 2 later, sometimes in a different county, recorded as white, with no document in between explaining the change. The DNA segments now surfacing in unrelated white Ozark families frequently trace to exactly this kind of transition, a family that crossed the color line once conditions allowed it and then simply never crossed back. What remains today is scattered across exactly the kinds of places you would expect a story like this to end up. A DNA testing company's ethnicity estimate, updated periodically as reference populations improve, still returning that same small, persistent Native American segment for thousands of Ozark-descended customers who have no idea where it might have come from. A handful of County Historical Society newsletters, tucked into archive boxes in Springfield or Harrison or West Plains, containing a single paragraph of testimony from someone's grandmother, recorded decades ago and never cross-referenced against anything. A family Bible somewhere in a Taney County attic with a page that simply stops. A woman recorded only by a first name and a marriage date, her own origin considered too unimportant or too dangerous to write down at the time. The Osage Nation's own enrollment records, the Cherokee Nation's citizenship rolls, and Missouri's and Arkansas's antebellum county archives all continue to hold pieces of this story, scattered across separate institutions that were never built to talk to each other, each one guarding a fragment that only makes full sense once it is placed beside a modern DNA result. The Buford family's creek bottom in Taney County is still there, still off most road maps. The log house long gone, but the general shape of the land unchanged since 1850. The Whitledge Hollow in Newton County looks much the same, a narrow valley still farmed by descendants of the same family that settled it, the story of Aunt Cindy's mother still unresolved on paper, and now, for the first time, partially confirmed in the genome of the great-great-grandsons who carry her segment forward without ever having known her name. What has changed for families like these is that a great-great-great-grandchild of a census-recorded 1850 household can now order a testing kit, spit into a tube, and receive back a small, unmistakable number that the county clerk who filled out that original census page could never have written down, would very likely have refused to write down even if he had somehow known it, and that the family itself spent 170 years calling by a name that was never really its own. The DNA does not resolve the story. It does not restore the name of the great-grandmother whose maiden name went unrecorded, or identify with certainty whether her ancestry ran Osage, Cherokee, or something else the record never distinguished, or account for the free black families whose surnames crossed the color line and left no document marking the crossing. What it does is confirm that she was there, that she mattered enough to leave a permanent trace in every descendant who carries her segment of the genome, and that the Hollow families who spent generations calling her Black Dutch were, in their own quiet and deliberately unspecific way, telling the truth the whole time, in the only form the truth was ever safe to take. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.